Pack your things and leave. This house belongs to us now. If you come back, I will call the police." Those were the exact words my daughter-in-law, Renee, spoke to me through the half-open doorway of the home I had built with my own 2 hands 31 years ago. She did not shout them. That was the part that stayed with me longest. She said them quietly, almost gently, the way you might tell a stray dog to get off your porch. Behind her, I could see the living room I had repainted every 5 years, the oak mantel I had carved myself, the summer my wife, Carol, was pregnant with our son Elliot. The family photographs were already gone from the walls, just pale rectangular shadows where they used to hang. My son was not at the door. He did not have the courage for that. I did not scream. I did not argue. I looked Renee in the eye for a long moment. Then I picked up the small overnight bag I had set on the porch steps, and I walked back to my truck. I heard the deadbolt slide shut behind me before I even reached the driveway. I sat behind the wheel for a minute with the engine off. The late September air coming through the cracked window smelled like fallen leaves and cold Georgia clay. I thought about Carol, who had died 4 years ago in that house, in the bedroom we shared for 28 years. I thought about how she used to say that a home was not the building. It was the people who showed up for each other inside it. I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. And I want you to know something. Before the sun came up the next morning, my phone showed 38 missed calls from a number I had not answered in 12 hours, but by then, there was nothing left to save. Not for them, anyway. Let me take you back to 3 days before that moment. 3 days before I stood on my own porch like a stranger. I had just been discharged from Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta after a minor cardiac episode. What the cardiologist called a warning arrhythmia. Nothing catastrophic. My blood pressure had spiked during a stressful week, closing out the third quarter accounts for my business, and my body had simply decided to send me a firm memo. I spent 4 nights under observation, had 2 stress tests, and was released on a Thursday morning with a new prescription, a stack of dietary pamphlets, and a firm instruction to reduce my workload for the next 6 weeks. I run a regional commercial refrigeration company. We install and service large-scale cooling systems for grocery chains, food distribution centers, and restaurant groups across northern Georgia and into South Carolina. I started it 23 years ago out of a rented garage in Marietta with 2 technicians and 1 used service van. Today we employ 41 people, hold service contracts with 4 major regional grocery chains, and carry a company valuation that my accountant estimated at just over $8 million at our last formal review. Elliot joined the company 6 years ago as operations director after a forgettable stint at a logistics firm in Charlotte. He had never shown much passion for the work, but he was family, and I genuinely believed that putting him in a position of real responsibility would give him direction. I gave him a strong salary, an equity pathway, and the kind of professional credibility that takes most people a decade to earn on their own. I thought I was being a good father. I handed him the map and told him I trusted him to read it. I now understand that was my first mistake. What I expected when I left the hospital was simple: to go home, sleep in my own bed, and begin the slow process of handing more day-to-day decisions over to my team. My cardiologist was clear that stress management was now a medical priority, not a personal preference. I had even spoken with Elliot on the phone the day before my discharge. He sounded attentive, concerned. He told me not to worry about the business. He said he and Renee had things handled. He just did not tell me which things he meant. I declined the hospital's offer to arrange transportation. I called my old friend Prentice, a retired civil engineer who had been my closest friend since our boys played Little League together 20 years ago, and asked him for a ride. I did not call Elliot. I wanted to arrive home quietly, without the performance of a welcome. I had been in that hospital bed for 4 days thinking about everything I still wanted to do, and the last thing I needed was my son and his wife standing in the driveway with rehearsed expressions of concern. Prentice picked me up at 10 in the morning. We stopped for coffee at the diner on Highway 92, the kind of place where the waitress knows your order and calls you honey without irony. I was feeling good, clear-headed, grateful to be breathing cool air that did not smell like antiseptic. When we pulled onto my road and I saw a locksmith's van parked in front of my house, I thought there had been some kind of break-in. I was wrong about that. The locksmith was just finishing up when we pulled into the driveway. He was packing his tools into a case, his back to me. I stepped out of the truck and asked him directly what had happened. He turned, looked at me, looked at the house, and then said carefully that he had been hired to rekey the front and rear entry doors, as well as the garage. He had the work order. The name on it was Elliot Caulfield. I stood there on my own driveway reading the work order, while Prentice stood beside me saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. I knocked on the front door. I heard footsteps from inside, 2 sets. The door opened to Renee. She was dressed neatly, composed, holding a ceramic coffee mug like she was posing for a real estate listing. I asked her where Elliot was. She said he was in the home office on a call and could not be interrupted. I asked why the locks had been changed on my house. She tilted her head and said it was not exactly my house anymore, was it? I told her I did not understand what she meant. She set the coffee mug down on the console table just inside the door. My console table, the one Carol picked out at an estate sale in 1998, and she told me that while I was in the hospital, Elliot had been in contact with our family attorney. She said that given my recent cardiac episode and my age, the family felt it was in my best interest to step back from the property and the business. She used the phrase cognitive and physical vulnerabilities. She said a geriatric care specialist had reviewed my hospital records and prepared a preliminary assessment. She said the attorney had advised them on their options. She said this as though she were reading from a pamphlet. No raised voice, no flicker of anything human. I asked her to show me the documents. She said Elliot would go over everything with me at the appropriate time. Then she told me that the house was going to be used as the primary residence for her and Elliot. During the business transition, that my belongings had been packed into the smaller storage unit behind the garage, and that they had arranged a very nice place for me in a senior living community in Alpharetta. She said it had a garden. She said it like the garden was supposed to fix something. I stood on that porch and I looked at this woman who had sat at my Thanksgiving table for 9 years, who I had helped put through a second round of graduate school when money was tight in her marriage, who had stood at Carol's gravesite and held my arm, and I felt something leave me, not anger, not grief exactly, more like the quiet, permanent closing of a door inside my chest. Renee told me, in that same flat voice, that if I caused a scene or contacted the police, their attorney was prepared to file emergency guardianship paperwork, asserting that my cardiac episode had resulted in diminished decision-making capacity. She said they had a doctor's signature ready. She said the assessment would hold up long enough to tie things up in court for a year or more, and that the stress of litigation might not be advisable given my heart condition. That last part, she let it sit there. She did not say it as a threat. She said it as a practical observation. Like she was doing me a favor. I picked up my bag. I said nothing, and I walked back to Prentice's truck. He drove without speaking for 10 minutes. Then he asked me if I wanted to go to his house. I said yes. On the drive over, I stared out the window at the Georgia countryside, and I thought about the conversation I needed to have. Not with Elliot, not with Renee. With my business attorney, Dale Hutchins, who had drafted every major contract my company had signed for the past 19 years, and who I had put on speed dial the day my cardiologist mentioned the word arrhythmia, like it was something I should plan around. We sat at Prentice's kitchen table with his old drip coffee maker going, and I called Dale. He answered on the second ring. I've told him what had happened in plain, sequential sentences, the way you report a problem to someone whose job it is to solve it. I told him about the locks, the care specialist, the guardianship threat, and the storage unit where my belongings had been relocated without my consent. There was a pause on the line. Then Dale asked me a question I had not expected. He asked if I remembered signing anything in the hospital. I went still. The second day of my stay, Elliot had visited in the early evening. I had been given a mild sedative the previous night to help me sleep, and I was still carrying that fog of medicated fatigue through most of the day. Elliot had come in with a folder, cheerful and reassuring, and told me there were some insurance continuity forms that the company's benefits administrator needed signed to keep our group health coverage active while I was out. He said it was routine. He laid the papers in front of me, indicated the signature lines, and I signed without reading closely. I was tired. I trusted him. He was my son. Dale was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said carefully that we needed to get a copy of whatever I had signed before we took any other steps. He told me not to make any public statements, not to show up at the house again, and not to contact Elliot until he had reviewed the documents. He said he was going to make some calls. I spent that first night at Prentice's house in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of trucks on the highway. I lay there and thought about the 41 people who worked for me. Good people, most of them. Technicians who had been with me 15 years. A dispatcher named Flora, who had started as a temp and ended up becoming the operational backbone of the whole company. An accounts manager who had postponed her own retirement twice because she said she was not ready to leave. They had no idea what was unfolding, and I thought about what Elliot had signed on my behalf, with my hand, while I was barely awake. The next morning, Dale called me before 7. He had spoken with his contact at the Georgia Secretary of State's office and with a forensic document specialist he used on fraud cases. He told me that among the papers I had signed was not just insurance documentation. Buried in the stack, formatted to look like a routine administrative form, was a limited power of attorney, granting Elliot temporary authority over company operational accounts and property decisions during my period of medical incapacitation. The language was specific enough to be legally operative and vague enough to be difficult to immediately challenge. Elliot had used that document to begin a transfer process, not of company funds into his own personal account, which would be obvious, but of something far more damaging and harder to reverse. He was trying to transfer the company itself. Dale explained it to me slowly. The commercial refrigeration company, the service contracts, the equipment assets, the intellectual property, all of it was in the process of being restructured under a new corporate entity that Elliot had quietly registered in Delaware 6 weeks earlier. A holding company. The registered agent was a woman I had never heard of. Dale had done some digging. She was Renee's college roommate from Clemson. She had a marketing consulting LLC and no experience in commercial refrigeration or anything adjacent to it. I asked Dale why. Why go through the trouble of a corporate restructuring when Elliot was already the operations director? Why not just wait for me to step down and hand it over legitimately? Dale said that was exactly the right question. He told me he had run a discreet financial audit request through a contact at our company's commercial bank, something he could do, given his standing as legal counsel of record. What came back was worse than I had feared. Over the past 8 months, Elliot had been making a series of structured withdrawals from the company's operating reserve. Amounts carefully kept below the threshold that would trigger automatic bank review. $12,000 here, $18,000 there, never quite reaching the $25,000 mark. In total, over $160,000 had been drained from accounts I had built over 2 decades. And it was not going toward business expenses. Dale traced the outflows to a series of payments to a private party, a sports and entertainment contract broker in Las Vegas who specialized in what was euphemistically called executive risk capital allocation. In plain language, a man who ran a high-stakes private sports betting syndicate. Elliot had been gambling with company money for the better part of a year, and he had lost. Dale said the outstanding liability Elliot had accumulated with this broker was somewhere in the range of $320,000. The broker had apparently made it clear that patience had run out. I sat in Prentice's kitchen with my coffee gone cold, and I understood everything at once. The rushed hospitalization, the locksmith, Renee's composed efficiency on the porch, the Delaware holding company, the hastily signed power of attorney. This was not a son who had decided he was ready to inherit the family business. This was a man who had been stealing from his father for the better part of a year and was now frantically rearranging the walls before the ceiling came down. He needed the company, not to run it, to liquidate enough of it quickly to settle a debt he was terrified of. And he needed me out of the way long enough to make that happen without my interference. The guardianship threat was not a plan for my future. It was a delay tactic. He needed 4 to 6 weeks of legal gray area, just enough time to move the assets out of my reach and into his holding company, close 1 or 2 service contract assignments for quick cash, and make his payment. He had gambled that a sick father, disoriented from a hospital stay, without immediate access to counsel, and facing the prospect of a public chainship filing, would simply back down. He did not know me as well as he thought. I told Prentice what I had learned over a long, quiet dinner that evening. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had since we were 32 years old arguing over baseball. When I finished, he looked at his coffee mug for a moment and said that we needed to make sure Elliot never saw this coming. He was right. Dale and I spent the following day building what I thought of as the quiet architecture of the response. I had prepared for something like this, not because I suspected Elliot specifically, but because 23 years in business had taught me that you prepare for catastrophic misuse of trust the same way you inspect your fire exits. Not because you plan for a fire, but because fires do not announce themselves. 3 years earlier, during a routine review of our corporate governance documents, I had worked with Dale to embed a specific contingency provision deep in the company's master operating agreement. The provision stated that any transfer, restructuring, or liquidation of company assets exceeding 20% of the firm's total valuation required my personal authorization through a 2-step verification process. A notarized affidavit signed in front of a specific independent attorney of my designation, and a secondary confirmation from our commercial bank's business services division that I had appeared in person and verbally confirmed the transaction. No digital signature, no proxy authorization, no power of attorney, however worded, could bypass it. Elliot had signed documents, filed paperwork, and started the restructuring process, without knowing that the ground beneath it was built on a foundation he had never seen. He was standing on a trapdoor, and he did not know where the handle was. Dale advised me that we had a narrow and precise window. The Delaware restructuring would take approximately 10 business days to fully process. Elliot was currently on day 6. If we moved too early and simply challenged the power of attorney, we would stop the immediate transfer, but Elliot would still have the documents, the leverage, and the narrative about my health. He could slow things down and fight in civil court for months. If we waited and let the restructuring attempt hit the wall of the operating agreement provision, the transaction would auto-reject, trigger a mandatory fraud review at the bank, and simultaneously generate a detailed record of every financial action Elliot had taken under the fraudulent power of attorney. A record that would go to our bank's compliance division, and from there, to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. But only if he actually tried to push it through, which meant we had to let him believe he was winning. Dale and I agreed. We went quiet. I stayed at Prentice's house. I did not answer Elliot's calls, and there were calls, 6 of them over 2 days, ranging in tone from breezy to slightly impatient, each one performed with that particular quality of casual confidence that comes from a person who believes they have already won and is simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. On the morning of the 4th day, I was sitting on Prentice's back porch, drinking coffee and watching the neighbor's dog investigate the fence line when my phone lit up. It was not a call this time. It was a text from Elliot. Just checking in. Hope you're settling in okay. The Alpharetta place said they have a spot for you whenever you're ready. Let me know if you need anything. I read it twice. The words were perfectly calibrated, warm enough to avoid accusation, distant enough to signal that my departure was expected and permanent. He was treating my exile from my own home the way you confirm a hotel reservation. I set the phone face down on the porch railing. I did not reply. What he did not know was that while he was composing that text from the home office of the house I built, Dale was on the phone with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime unit. Not filing a formal report yet, but establishing contact and building a procedural record. He was also preparing an emergency motion to invalidate the power of attorney on grounds of fraudulent inducement. Specifically, that I had been given the document under false pretenses while medicated and without independent legal counsel present, and he was talking to the compliance officer at our commercial bank, providing documentation of the structured withdrawals, and making sure the appropriate flags were placed on the Delaware transfer request before it could be processed. The trap was ready. We simply had to wait for Elliot to walk into it. He did, on a Friday morning at 9:47. I know the exact time because Dale called me within 10 minutes. He said the Delaware transfer request had hit the bank's review queue, been matched to the operating agreement provision, and been automatically rejected. The bank's fraud detection protocol had flagged the entire transaction file. The system had pulled 12 months of account activity, cross-referenced it with the structured withdrawals, identified the pattern, and generated a suspicious activity report that went directly to the Federal Reserve's financial crimes reporting system. From there, it was automatically shared with the FBI. Elliot did not know any of this had happened yet. He likely still thought the transfer was processing normally. Dale told me to sit tight. He said the next few hours would unfold the way they were going to unfold, and that my job right now was to be somewhere calm with a witness. I told him I would be at Prentice's house. I poured myself another cup of coffee. My phone rang at 11:13. Elliot. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again 4 minutes later. Voicemail. Then again and again, a pattern of escalating urgency that told me he had finally looked at his banking app and seen the red rejection notice sitting where his future was supposed to be. By the time I had counted 38 missed calls, the tone of his voicemails had traveled the full arc of collapse. The first 3 were businesslike, almost cheerful, asking me to call the bank and clear up a processing issue. By the 10th, the cheerfulness had fractured. By the 20th, he was using the word please in a way I had never heard from him before. By the 35th, he was crying. I listened to each one. I did not skip a single message. I thought he deserved to be fully heard, even if there was nothing I could do with what I was hearing. The 38th voicemail was the one that told the truth. His voice was completely flat by then, the performance entirely gone. He said the people he owed money to had been in contact. He said they knew where he lived. He said Renee had left, had taken her car, and gone to her mother's in Savannah the moment things went wrong, leaving him alone in my house, with his debt and his decisions. He said he needed me to call the bank and authorize the transfer. He said he was sorry. He said he knew he had done wrong. He said please, one more time. At the end, I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment after that last message finished. Outside, a cardinal landed on the fence post at the edge of Prentice's yard, brilliant red against the November gray. I watched it for a few seconds. Then I called Elliot back. He answered before it finished the first ring. He started talking immediately, fast, breathless, not quite coherent, cycling between justification and apology. I let him go for almost a full minute. Then I spoke, quietly, and he stopped. I told him that the bank transfer had not failed because of a processing error. I told him that the company's master operating agreement contained a provision he had never bothered to read, one that required my physical, in-person authorization for any transaction of this magnitude, and that no power of attorney, however it was obtained, could substitute for that. I told him that Dale had been my attorney of record for 19 years, and that from the moment the locks were changed on my house, a legal process had been moving forward quietly and without his awareness. I told him that the structured withdrawals from the operating reserve had been documented, traced, and reported. I told him the FBI had already been contacted. The silence on the other end of the line was the kind you feel in your chest. Elliot said very quietly that he could explain. I told him that the time for explanation had passed. I told him that what happened next would be determined by federal investigators, not by me. I told him that whatever arrangement he had made with the man in Las Vegas was his problem to solve, and that the company, the house, and the accounts were no longer accessible to him in any form. He said my name, just once, the way a child says it. I told him I loved him. I told him that had never been the question. I told him I was sorry we had arrived at this place. And then I told him that I hoped the people he had hired as his attorney were very good because he was going to need them. Then I ended the call. I sat for a long time after that. Prentice came in from the garage where he'd been pretending to organize something, looked at me, and without a word put a fresh cup of coffee on the table and sat down across from me. We did not talk for about 10 minutes. The cardinal was gone from the fence post. The yard was very still. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not triumph. There was no satisfaction in it, Not the way you might feel when you win a contract or close a strong quarter. It was more like the feeling after a long illness finally breaks. Not joy, just the absence of pain. Just the strange, hollow quiet of something that had been going on for a very long time being over. Elliot was arrested the following Tuesday. The federal charges were what Dale had anticipated: wire fraud, embezzlement, fraudulent execution of a legal instrument, and conspiracy. Renee was later indicted separately for her role in the scheme. She had been present when the power of attorney was explained to the attorney they had hired, had reviewed the strategy with full knowledge, and her digital communications made her participation clear. Her roommate, the woman listed as registered agent on the Delaware Holding Company, received a separate charge of conspiracy. Dale appeared before a federal magistrate and secured the invalidation of the power of attorney within 72 hours of the arrest. The locksmith's work was undone the same week, professionally this time, by a company whose invoice I paid myself. The first morning I walked back through my own front door, the house felt different, quieter than I remembered it. Empty. The pale rectangles on the walls where the photographs had been were still there. I stood in the entryway for a minute, just letting the silence settle around me. Then I went to the storage unit behind the garage, where my belongings had been boxed and stacked, and I began to bring things back in. It took most of an afternoon. The photographs were there, carefully wrapped in moving paper. The last one I rehung was the one from Carol's 62nd birthday, the one where she is laughing at something just off camera, her eyes completely lit up. I put it back on the nail where it had always been, stepped back to make sure it was level, and stood there looking at it for a while. That evening I called a full company meeting at the office, all 41 employees. I told them plainly what had happened, what had almost happened, and what was not going to happen. I told them the company was intact, the contracts were intact, and their jobs were intact. Flora, the dispatcher, started crying. A couple of the senior technicians looked like they might. I told them I was reducing my hours for the next few months on doctor's orders, but that I would be present, that I was not going anywhere, and that the company they had helped me build was going to be here for a long time. I meant it. In the months that followed, I worked with Dale to restructure the operational leadership of the company in a way that did not depend on me being in the room for every decision. I promoted Flora to operations director, the role Elliot had held. She had been doing most of the actual operational work for years, without the title or the salary to match, and she took the position with a kind of quiet dignity that made me feel I had been overdue in offering it. I brought in an outside certified public accountant to conduct an independent audit and implement a new set of financial controls. I closed the operating account that had been drained and opened a new one with a dual authorization requirement for all withdrawals above $5,000, and I updated my will. Specifically, I established a charitable trust directed toward apprenticeship programs for young people entering the skilled trades in Georgia. HVAC, electrical, commercial refrigeration. The kind of work I had built my life on. The trust would be administered by a 3-person board, Dale, Prentice, and a local vocational school director I had known for years. Elliot was not named in the will, not in anger, simply because the document now reflected the reality of what I had learned about who he was, and what I owed to the people who had actually shown up. Prentice came to the attorney's office the day I signed the new documents. Afterward, we went to the same diner on Highway 92, sat in the same booth, and ordered the same coffee. The waitress called us honey. The afternoon sun came through the window, at an angle that made the table look like it belonged in a different era. Prentice asked me if I was at peace with all of it. I thought about that for a while before I answered. I told him I was not sure peace was exactly the right word. I told him that what I had come to was something closer to clarity. That I understood now, in a way I had not before, that loving someone does not protect them from the consequences of what they choose to do. That a father can give everything and still end up at the wrong end of a locksmith's van. That the loyalty you build among people who choose you, not the ones who inherit you, but the ones who show up, that is the thing that holds when everything else gives way. I told him I had 41 of those people, and a best friend who made terrible coffee, and that on balance I had no complaints. He told me my taste in coffee was also terrible, which was fair. Outside, the Georgia sky was doing what it does in late November, going that particular shade of blue that looks like something you would want to keep. I finished my cup and did not rush to leave. The people who tried to take everything I had are now answering for what they did. The company is standing. The house is mine again. And every morning I come downstairs, put the kettle on, and look at the photograph of Carol laughing at something just off camera. And I think that she would have had something sharp and perfectly accurate to say about all of this. I think she would have said, "You always knew what mattered. You just had to lose it for a minute to remember for certain." She was usually right about those things. If any part of this story has spoken to something in your own life, I hope you will leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And if you have found yourself in a fight to protect what you have built, your name, your work, your peace, I want you to know that the quiet fight is often the most powerful one. You do not have to make noise to win. You just have to know where you put the foundation. Subscribe if you would like to hear more stories like this one. I will see you in the next one.